Hey everybody, this is Daniel Carba here, and I am a front-end developer focused in React, JavaScript, TypeScript, and Redux. And today I will be going over a project that I've worked on. This one is just a social media page skeleton. So it has a lot of interactivity between three different sections. First here is our users list that I have here. We have a arrow we can click on, which pulls it down. If you notice, there was a skeleton loading page here. We have, it says here, albums for Trisha, which is the randomly generated user that I have here. These album titles are also randomly generated via Faker.js API. We can add albums here. So if I click add album, it will reload and then load up a new album. If we click into an album here, we can see that this is where we can have our photos. We can add a photo. If you notice, if you hover over the photos, you can click on them and delete them, and they will persist here. And then we can go to different albums. We have different amounts of photos. If there haven't been any loaded, then it just doesn't take up the empty space here. We can close this. And we can do the same with other users here. Let's say we want to delete a user. We can go to this trash can, click delete, and that will persist because we have that data saved in a db.json in the project file. We can add user, which will do a similar thing, just a randomly generated person. And that's pretty much an overview of the project. So again, we broke things down into users, and then albums, and then photos. So that was how I thought about breaking down the project. And now let's go ahead and take a look at the code itself. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is kind of go over the tech stack that I used for this project. So the easiest way to do that is to go into our project, my project itself here, and go into the package.json. We can look at our dependencies. So as we can see here, first we have Faker.js, which I mentioned before is basically the API that generates our simulated user data. We've got Redux toolkit, which is going to take care of our state between the users, the albums, and the photos. I used Axios for some of the thunks for users. Class names here was used just with some of our functional components, like the buttons and drop-down menus here, just to add a lot of classes and keep them organized. JSON server was just our simulated server to hold our user data, which is held here in the db.json file. Of course, we have all of the React packages. We've got React DOM. We used React icons because the icons used in the UI come from that package. We also have Redux, and we have our scripts, and then the web vitals is boilerplate. For our scripts here, we just got the npm run start and the npm run start server for our JSON server, which will look in port 3005 in my case here. And that's basically it for the tech stack. So the next thing I want to go over is some of the file structure I have here for my project. So in the public folder, all of this is basically just boilerplate from a Create React App project. So most of that is untouched and unused. Inside the source folder here, though, is where the majority of my code for the project lies. So if we look in here, we have three main folders. We've got a components folder, a hooks folder, and the store folder. Before we go into those, let me just go over a few of these miscellaneous files in here. As we can see, I also used Tailwind CSS for the styling of the project. Here we also have just the app.js, where we connect the users list in and just gave it some basic class names to fit it nicely on the page with some decent borders. In our index.css, we just configure our Tailwind properties so that we can use Tailwind in the project. And then here in the index.js is where we have our boilerplate to initialize the React parts of our project, including the provider and the store for our Redux functionality, which I will go into in a little bit here. So let's go ahead and go into those folders now. First, I'm actually going to go into the store because that was the first thing that I started working on before I got too deep into using the components, since I needed to know how to hook that state up to each of those components as they were created. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go into the index.js file inside the store. So here I have all of your helper functions here. We're configuring our store. We set up listeners via Redux Toolkit query. We have the user's reducer, our albums API, and photos API. So here we've configured our store with our reducers for each of the three categories: users, albums, and photos. We have our middleware that we can cat in here. We set up our listeners for the store, and then we export out all of the thunks, all of the queries and mutations from the toolkit query for both our albums and photos, and those can be accessed to all the components. So a main thing I want to go over with this project is the fact that with one of the three categories, I used thunks because I wanted to get to know thunks before working in Redux Toolkit query. So thunks in Redux was kind of the old way you would use Redux before Toolkit query became more popular and more widely used. So for users, I just created three different action functions here: add user, fetch users, and remove user. So we can go into the add user.js. We created an async thunk and basically just used Axios here into 3005 users, and the name using the faker JS API, creating a full name of a person, and this creates the user. Simple enough. For fetching users, we do something similar here, get the list of users. Note here that we have this pause created just for testing, so that way I could test the skeleton that I have. And then we export out that fetch users. We do the same with remove user, just using the delete method with Axios to the user's ID. So those are our thunks. Through those thunks, we have our user slice. So we bring in each of those thunks into our user slice. We initialize that, create our reducers for each of the states, and say what this happening with each state, whether it's pending, fulfilled, or rejected for each of the three thunks. And then for the other two, since this is a lot of code and there's going to be even more with the photos and albums, I decided to use Redux Toolkit query to fill these out. So if we go into the APIs and into albums API.js, so we've brought in the create API and fetch base query hooks for Redux Toolkit query, and we initialize our albums. We have our base URL, we have our pause function once again, We return the mutation of removing an album. I've also included tags so that we can keep track of the album name and ID information. And then our query here where we delete the album. Same with adding albums, same with fetching albums. And then we export out each of these either queries or mutations depending on the type of data manipulation we're doing here. So similar thing with the photos API.js, just with the photos instead of albums. We also have the use thunk.js here that includes a couple sets of state that we use for us to run each of our thunks. So this just runs the thunks. Basically a created hook so that I could use the thunks in the components without too much extra code. So that is a look at the Redux side of the project with the store, our hooks and thunks, and Redux Toolkit query. So the last section of the code for this project that I want to go over is in the components folder, and that is because this is the largest folder in terms of just number of files. Most of these files are pretty small. So we first have our button.js, which just helps us kind of style and initialize a bunch of different buttons that we may need to use in the future to some Tailwind CSS properties. And then we also have a basic panel, which I actually believe was used in an earlier version of the project before we had our expandable panel. So we'll just go ahead and go to the expandable panel. And in here, we have just some classes for our panels. I included the lovely colors that you saw earlier, the purple and the sky blue, two of my favorite colors. And yeah, we just have the logic for the window itself, changing the state when it's clicked on. We'll also look at the skeleton real quick first. So we have the class names helper function here. We've given it a bunch of Tailwind CSS properties again for the skeleton. We pull in that class name. From here, we have our boxes for each of the lines of the skeleton, and we fill those in with the correct data. From here, let's go into each of the 3 sections of the project. So next we'll go through our users, which is the section that uses the thunks. So we're going to be importing in a lot more stuff than we will for the albums or the photos. So we have our use effect, use selector, helper functions. When we go in here, we have a lot of state that we need to deal with to match with each of our thunks. So we have the 3 sets of state for the fetch users, the 3 sets of state for the add user thunk, and then we are using the use selector to continuously return our list of users. And then with our use effect here, we on initial load only load it up one time without re-rendering the project. And we handle our user add when we click the add user button, which is in here. There's some logic for the skeleton to load. We have more of our JSX code here for adding that user. And then for our individual items of each user, this is where we have the removing user thunk, since that happens when you're clicked inside the user in the project. So similar process, we have a fragment here for our header, which may or may not be there depending on the state of the project. And then we return that panel with the albums list of users. So to go to the albums list item, now we are using Redux toolkit query instead of just Redux and thunks. So we have our album mutation from our store. We have another header React fragment here with the buttons that we can use with the album list and the different sets of state for what happens with that. And we return our render of the albums list item with the photos list inside the album if the photos exist. So then we go to albums list, we fetch the albums with the user, with a given user. We have our state of adding the album mutation. We have our logic here for fetching the albums list and the skeleton while it is loading. And then if it fails to find the albums list, give an error loading albums, or else if it does find the list, map through the data of albums and return those albums. And then we have a remaining JSX here, giving our albums for, and then dynamically using the user's name, and then a button to add an album that lets users add an album, and then display the content. So that is it for albums. And then the last thing is photos. Very similar to albums. We'll go into the photos list item first. We do the remove photo mutation only in the photo itself. That is when we hover over the photo and click the icon. We have our JSX here that just displays our photos with good styling, good spacing, in a nice square format. And then our photos list has our other two, our query for fetching the photos and the mutation for adding photos. We add the photo via that button, which is in here. We have our similar logic for the skeleton while it loads the photos. And that's pretty much it. That is all the aspects of our project here. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed learning about my latest project using React, Redux, and Redux Toolkit Query. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I hope you all have a good day. Thank you.